All right, there's one. There's two. There we go. I'll switch angles as soon as we get started here. Get something else done.
Hello, everybody.
How are you doing?
Chris, can we start?
I think so.
This is the Board of Selectmen's meeting for February 23, 2021. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the Open Meeting Law, General Laws, Chapter 30A, Section 18, and the Governor's March 15, 2020 order imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place. This meeting of the Medfield Select Board is being conducted via remote participation. No in-person attendance of members of the public will be permitted, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings as provided for in the order. A reminder that the persons who would like to listen or view this meeting while in progress may do so by following the instructions on the agenda and meeting notice. All votes subject to remote participation, therefore will be roll call votes. And I think it reminded everybody that we're being recorded, and we'd like to start our meetings now with a moment of appreciation for our troops who are serving around the globe. Thank you. So we've got an appointment with the Medfield State Hospital Development Committee to discuss this Medfield State Hospital request for proposals. Chair Todd Trehubenko. Todd, thanks for coming. Thanks for all your work on this.
Hi, good evening.
Hi, Todd. It's like you're appearing out of the mist from across the field. So far, we see your name.
Yeah, that's probably a pretty accurate description. I was watching the beginning of your meeting, and then you mentioned my name, and everything went dark. Then I came back.
Oh. Well, thanks for coming back.
Sure. So, as we talked about the last time, we have this draft version 2 of the RFP circulating, and pursuant to the approval that was given at that meeting, we did send that off to the Massachusetts Historical Commission and the local historical commissions. And, you know, under the memorandum of agreement with DCAM and those parties, they have 14 days to review. So we've not heard anything back yet. Of the 14 days, if you used all of them, would put you at March 3rd, which is a Wednesday. So, you know, we've continued to receive comments as both versions of the RFP, you know, have now been posted. We've been reviewing, and the development committee will have another meeting tomorrow night to go through significant remaining comments, including any that we may be receiving tonight from the selectmen.
Okay, sure you're ready for questions and comments?
Yes.
Okay, Gus, do you want to start? You need to unmute yourself, Gus.
I've actually already provided Todd with specific edits and things to the RFP, so I won't go into that. Just so you two know what the nature of my comments were. Primarily, I was taking a closer look at the scoring mechanism that we have to make sure that it makes sense, and that was, I think, a primary change that I recommended. Most of the other things were pretty much consistent with changes that I'd provided them in the past. So I think from my standpoint as a member of the committee, I think we're on a good path.
Good. That's a good thing to hear from a committee member. Mike, do you want to?
I think so.
Well, Gus, could you describe a little bit what your comments are on the scoring mechanism? Because I have a comment there as well.
Yeah, sure. So first, if you want to know, my background in terms of what I'm bringing to the table here is not around real estate development. It's around federal contracting. And so the nature of my comments had to do with the different categories that we have there and how the score sheet would be used. So the way it was worded, I think in the discussions that we've had, it is not necessary for us to be explicit in this RFP about how we will weight those various categories. However, the way they're structured, where some of the sub items in those 4 major categories, some have more than others. My question was around, if you use a 4-point scale, you're not really weighting things in any particular way, but one category has 6 sub items and another one has 3. As a mathematical matter, you have one category that has the capability of getting twice as many points as the other. So effectively it's weighted. So my issues were not philosophical around what we're looking for. They were literally mechanical to ensure that the information that when we do the evaluations and we assess them, the information that we create does not have embedded biases just in the sheer structure of the scorecard. So that was the nature of my concern.
And what's your conclusion from that?
Well, I think the specific mechanics we probably will have further discussions at our next committee meeting. The intent would be to make sure that we do not have a scorecard that's structured in a way to lead to results that are unintended by virtue of the algorithm that we're using to total up numbers, I think is the short answer. I guess one other comment I had in the last category, which is the one where we're looking at the team. One opinion for that committee was, it seemed to me that we might want to split that one into one that looks at the general corporate experience. And the thought there was, if somebody bids and they cite a project that they've already done, you can look at that project and you'll get a sense of the quality, focus, and the general, does it look like the kind of project you'd want? That's a separate question from the question of who are you planning to put in charge of this, the staffing question about who would actually run this project. So as a suggestion, at least, rather than folding those two into one category, which is that fourth category in the score sheet, I think the committee might want to consider splitting that apart from demonstrated successful projects and what they look like, from who are you going to put on this project and what are their qualifications.
How do you avoid the problem then of if we're not going to weight it, if we're not going to put a percentage as to each of the categories, how do you avoid the weighting issue that you've identified? I mean, or is it just a topic for discussion and you don't have a proposed solution?
Todd, I might let you talk. So I'll give you an answer, Mike, but then Todd, maybe you want to add to my answer. I came into one of our meetings with the question that we should weight them. And I think in our discussion, because this is kind of a two-stage, there's the response from the RFP, and we will identify a number of, hopefully we'll identify a number of qualified developers that we think are worth further discussion to actually get to a final answer. The discussion that we had in the committee, as I understood it, was that it's not that critical to specify weighting across the different categories, because that allows us to kind of continue to use some discretion in terms of how we get to an overall evaluation. That's not in federal, aerospace defense contracting, you wouldn't be able to do that. But I think what I heard is that in real estate development, with this kind of a sort of two-stage process, I get the sense that maybe that's not an unprecedented practice.
So, for my part, I think there'll be some additional discussion at the committee meeting tomorrow night. I do think, everyone on the committee wants to make sure that we're evaluating, all key criteria, but at the same time, not have a document that might be, vulnerable to questions about how things were scored. And, I think there probably is some interest on the part of the committee in going to an overall weighting. Maybe you have the 4 or 5 categories that have a weight per category, not weighting of each, sub item. So I think that's one of the key remaining issues for us to discuss tomorrow night. I know, for example, when I was on the Affordable Housing Trust and, the Hinckley property RFP was written, there was some very clear weightings in the criteria. We did the same thing when we were looking for consulting help on the development committee. And, I'm not sure there's consensus on, what the individual weightings might be if we were to go towards a weighting system. But I think, based on our own re-review and comments we've been receiving, it's worth taking that up and trying to resolve it. And between now and then, I'll have another conversation with our consultant about what 30B, what's specifically required. So we make sure that if we're moving to a different approach, we're still in compliance with any state requirements that might be applicable.
Yeah, because that was one of the topics I wanted to discuss here tonight, because I worry about a couple of things. I mean, one, I worry about kind of faux precision, right? You sort of put numbers to something and it lends a sort of indicia of precision to it. Just like when you write something down and you post it on the internet, for some reason, it takes on a greater level of credibility, regardless of whether it's tied to anything, right? You can write a bunch of numbers on a page and say, look at these numbers, they can be meaningless. But I think the way our brains are wired, we sort of gravitate towards them because we like the idea of precision and exactitude. So my concern is if we have kind of unweighted criteria with numbers attached, I think the natural way a lot of people's brains work who are not going to read the whole RFP and aren't going to read where it says, we reserve the right to weight this however we want, or whatever the verbiage is. And so, well, why didn't you just go with the highest score, assuming that there are people who think, well, the highest score is the one that they wanted, and if we went to something else. And so that's part of the concern that I have, is that if we're going to weight it, though, I think we should weight it the way we're actually going to weight it, in the sense that here's what we think is most important, because that also sends an important signal to developers saying, okay, here are all these categories. It's not a matter of a checklist. It's not a matter of getting the most fours or getting the biggest total. It's like, all right, if you do really well in this category, maybe you don't have to be good in the others. And so I would take seriously the view of the committee and the consultant and everybody else on that. But I worry about putting numbers to something and then saying, well, we're just going to sort of use them as a guide, because some people will seize on them and say either that you should just go with the highest score, assuming that's the one that person likes, or we'll end up debating about between 3 and 4 and 2.5 and 3.5 when none of this is that precise, right? And the only thing that I think it's close to precise would be if you're rating kind of upfront consideration, whatever the highest number is in cash, that's pretty objective, right? But otherwise, there's a measure of judgment that you have to bring to it. So I would lean towards saying we're going to weight it, and weight it the way we think it should be weighted up front. So we're going to say this is the most important one, that's the second most important one, this is the third, and this is the mix. And so at least that gives us some guidance, and it's a check ourselves against upfront what we thought was the right way to weight these things. But I'll take the committee's view on that. I don't like the way it's currently done, because I do think it's got to be a little tighter. And if we are going to have some sort of scoring system, we've got to be pretty clear about what that scoring system is and what we're using it for, rather than have it really be like a true score sheet. It's one piece of the puzzle.
I had assumed that there would be a lot of discretion that the town would have in looking over the proposals and even the numbers, that it wasn't a highest total is going to win, but that it's a tool to help evaluate the different proposals, but that we're going to really take a serious look at the different elements. And I mean, unless you weight these things, they're just not comparable. So that, so I just assumed that we were that given the way that this was structured and drafted, that we would just have a lot of discretion when the results came in. But I'm happy to have it weighted.
I think that's right, Pete. But I think it's the problem is it's both. That's what we intend, but then there's this natural pull against that, saying, well, if you have this mathematical score sheet, and then people will say, well, you had a preferred one, so you weren't really scoring this the right way. You were trying to score it, so you reached a predetermined conclusion. And you end up having a lot of discussion about the score sheet when really we should be talking about the categories. And so I'm fine to do it. I know this is one of the ways that this is done, and I think it is a useful check, particularly if we put some thought into it up front on how we would weight them, even if we're not going to assign a percentage to it. But I think that there are pitfalls there if it's not very clear, both to the developers, but also to the general public who are going to be reviewing our work on this at some point, that, this was a guide. This was one piece of the puzzle, just in the way the reuse plan is a guide. The draft town master plan is a guide. The town goals are a guide. There's a lot of things against which I think we will compare the proposals. And this is one of them. And we want to be upfront with the developers about it, so the proposals will address these criteria. But I want to get others' input, and I just want to flag it as a concern that I have. My preference would be to weight them the way we're going to weight them in the end, the way we think is most important, to say this is most important, even if the percentages we pick have a measure of judgment and subjectivity to them.
Yeah, Mike, if I could comment on, not here, I'm commenting on an area that is in my technical background, not for real estate development, but this methodology and how it gets used. I think the intent in this process is not to put in place a quantitative, structure, which is the magic 8 ball that when you come out at the end, the high score wins. No thought, no discretion, no judgment, no sophistication is required. Usually a structure like this, if the weighting is important, for me, as I would look at it, the weighting is important because it signals information to the prospective bidders about what we think is what we care the most about. It's not a question of how we're going to calculate a total number. It's actually a way of telling bidders, here's the things we care the most about. That's really it. As a practical matter for what I think we're trying to do here, having a structure like this will allow the committee in doing its evaluation, and I don't know exactly how we'll do it, but I'm guessing at some point in this process, we each will be looking at things and coming up with our own thoughts about what the scores are. And then we're probably going to compare what everybody thought. And so what's useful for a structure like this, in my experience, is that you then go through that drill, you come up with those numbers, and then you all come together and kind of, it's a shorthand way of uncovering where different people might have thought different ways about evaluating the same thing, and that drives a useful discussion. But from a professional standpoint, having taught this for a number of years, the thing that's interesting to me when you do it, so if we had 4 or 5 categories, at the end of the day, when you've made a decision, you can turn this process inside out and take a look at which option you favored. And while there may have been 4 categories, in like 100% of my experience, you ultimately discover that there are 1 or sometimes 2 of those factors that effectively turn out to be the drivers of your decision. It's not all of them. It's that there's 1 or 2 when you go and turn the results inside out, you can sit there and say, the reason we're making this decision is because of this and that. And that's, it's kind of it took me years to learn and realize that. But the way I would look at this whole process, and Todd, I think you might have a different view, so chime in. This is a way for us to structure our thinking to support a discussion we're going to have to get to a recommendation. It's not the magic 8 ball that says, well, came in, we ran it through the meat grinder, and this one was an 83.75 and that one was an 81.23. So this is the best one. It's not going to be like that.
Right. No, I actually agree with that. And the RFP is issued pursuant to the authority of the selectmen. So I think the committee can be helpful in rating and ranking and, making recommendations or presenting findings to the selectmen. But at the end of the day, how you all look at it is going to be very important, and kind of regardless of someone on the committee might have rated, the package of benefits for the community, your views may be different. So the intent was to not to lock anyone in, but to just be able to rate a wide variety of criteria that would be relevant to an overall conclusion. So, and we've got 7 people on the committee, including Gus. So, I think tomorrow night we'll spend a significant portion of our meeting kind of going through this and seeing where we can make improvements over the current draft.
And I think those weights may be a lot of help to the developers who are looking at what we want. So I think that'll be a good thing to do.
That's a good point.
Anything else, Mike?
I have a few more. Yeah.
Go ahead.
And again, these are going to be more conceptual, and I can kind of point out where I think it plays, where it would play into the specifics. But I want to touch on it more generally, and then we can talk about whether it goes in any particular place. Kind of in the project background and in the discussion of the reuse master plan and the master planning process, I think there's a little bit of a misleading picture in the RFP, and I think it's unintentional. I think it leaves out a kind of a portion of the background and some of the assumptions that I think we ought to make more explicit. And that's that. I mean, I think if you take the reuse master plan, the so-called preferred scenario, and all of that, I mean, I don't know that it actually represents kind of what the town wants to have at the state hospital. I think it represents kind of the best we could do and the best we could live with, given the assumptions we had about the viability of the hospital site, particularly about the viability of the hospital site for commercial and non-residential development. I don't think if people had their druthers, they would pick a mix of residential versus commercial development that is in the reuse master plan. But I think that the master plan, frankly, and I think that the committee members were candid about this, even stretched to include a higher percentage of potential commercial and non-residential uses than the committee believed at the time that the market could bear. And so I would like to see in the RFP the idea that that was the underlying assumption circa 2016, 2017, when the master planning committee took all the inputs from the various sources and all the information they had and formulated the reuse master plan. I think we should make explicit that if a developer believes that non-residential commercial development is more viable than the master planning committee believed at the time when they developed this plan, that we would welcome proposals that have more commercial development in it than what was contemplated by the preferred scenario and contemplated by the reuse master plan. And while we're not enthusiastic about zoning changes, we would be more enthusiastic about zoning changes that facilitated commercial development, because I think across all of the various goal setting exercises that the town is engaged in, the draft master plan, the selectmen's goals, everywhere you look, diversifying the town's tax base is an important goal for the town, and it's important for the town. And so it may well be that the assumptions that the reuse master planning committee had and the assumptions on which the proposal was based are still true, but obviously the experience of the last year, the pandemic, and a lot of things may have, at least in some sectors, changed some people's minds or given some different people a different idea about the viability of that kind of a site that's not in the middle of Kendall Square for some commercial uses and different uses. Now I realize that the bulk of the property, there's a lot of permissible commercial uses. So it may well be that it's sufficient as is and between the special permits and the planning board permits. But I think that in reading it, if I were a developer reading this, I would get the idea that the town really principally wants to use this site for housing. And this is the mix that they want. And they're concerned about the mix of housing. Whereas I think if you put all the comments and the thoughts and everything that people had together, I think the view was we could live with the mix that's stated there, but that's not really the preference. And so I think we ought to be encouraging developers who have a more optimistic view or have about the commercial prospects there, or even kind of whether it's companies or people who aren't necessarily classical developers, but might have a view for the property and recognize we would welcome additional commercial proposals. So that's kind of the first conceptual point that I had that I'd like to see reflected in the RFP. And I don't know if it gets added to the narrative or if we pare back some of the goals and the disposition intent that's kind of lifted from the reuse master planning and the kind of preamble to the zoning to get that. But that was missing for me in the RFP. And I do think, I don't know that anybody would necessarily be averse to additional commercial and non-residential, assuming it's not like a steel mill or something like that.
Mike, let me react. I had not appreciated that was your perspective. If to the extent that's been a perspective of yours for a while, I just didn't personally appreciate it. I can say that over the years, all of the discussions that I've heard have been geared toward guarding against a developer who wants to come in and increase the number of residences. So I think all of our discussions have been guarding against, the opposite of the direction that you're talking about. So
I'm talking about decreasing the residences, increasing the commercial.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, but that's the opposite of what we thought we had to be worrying about. So I think I'm intrigued by the comment you made. If I were to react, one part of my reaction to that would be at the time we were developing the master plan, there was a key component was the affordable housing component, but we're beyond that now because the affordable housing has gone elsewhere. So that driver at least has gone away. As a piece of property from a resident, as a place to live, it is sort of a beautiful piece of property. But I have a question for you, and it's a sincere question. I just haven't thought it through. Let me give you a scenario. EMC announces that they want it to be a little bit closer into Boston than Hopkinton, and they're interested in moving a corporate campus, in Medfield. That feels to me like that's too far away from the master plan, given the 5-year $500,000 effort that we made to, to get to what we got to. Would that kind of a scenario fall into something that you would want to leave open as a possibility, or did I just take it way too far?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would be open to that too.
I think the presumption of that 5-year process was that there was no prospect for that. We were too far from the highway. We were too far from commuter rail. There's not enough people who commute by kayak, that sort of thing. So I think that the whole process had the assumption that that's not, and I had the same view, right? I had the same view that was not a viable option. That if you let the developers run wild, the developers, what they want to put up there, they want to put 400 super nice houses up there in Indian Hill 2.0, right, or something like that, and that's where the real monetary value was, and that the master plan is trying to negotiate between all of those things. But yeah, I mean, I think something like that, because as to the public, because it also plays into the public access piece of it and the cultural arts center piece of it. I mean, I think that if the CAM effort is successful, it's a little bit of an odd fit with a purely residential area to a certain extent, right? And just in terms of a lot of people, things happening there at night, happening on the weekends, and it could fit with it, right? And I think ideally you'd have kind of residences for which it's an additive use. But I think if you had more commercial, I think that would where more people might be there at night, or conversely, where everybody clears out at night because it's offices. And I also think from the public access standpoint, I do think that the more residential it is, the less at home people are going to feel just kind of driving up there and walking around because you're kind of in somebody's neighborhood to a certain extent. And maybe that's not true, but I do think if it's a little more commercial and it's more open and there's more kind of people who don't live there walking around, I think it maybe is a little more welcoming, and there are kind of commercial places, different places that are better integrated, like MathWorks and things like that. They have different kinds of pieces of it that you kind of go to. So again, it may well be that the presumptions are still the case. The bedrock assumptions are still true, but I kind of wanted to put out a little more expressly the idea that, hey, if you have a view for this in this direction that's different than ours, we would welcome that direction. Now, again, I don't think it's going to be a big corporate campus, right? I don't think it's going to be that because it's still too far from the highway. It's still not near the commuter rail. It still has all of those negatives. It's still not on it's still not on a main drag in any sense, but you might have something smaller or more modest, but that's still more than was anticipated originally. So that was kind of my first conceptual point. So, and then the second one kind of, which again is sort of on one of my particular hobby horses here. And I don't think this will come as a surprise to either of you. I think that, and I appreciated the edits to the plan that referenced the possibility of a partial disposition, a plan for a part of the property. I would like to say a little more about that in this. And I'm not sure the best way to do that, because I mean, obviously this is something I've talked about a lot, so it's not a surprise. I mean, I think if I could wave a magic wand and have the development I wanted, it would not be a development of the entire property, right? Because at least in my view, based on what's in the reuse master plan, the preferred scenario, it kind of doesn't do enough to make that be the final answer as to what we're going to do there. But I think, as to a partial proposal, I think in the narrative or in the explanation, the developer, if a developer has a proposal for a partial development, they've got to address a couple of things. One of which is its connection to the CAM site. So I think any sort of partial proposal has to connect the CAM site to everything else. It can't be a partial proposal that leaves the lead chapel sort of on an island there. It's got to kind of at least cover enough of it to get that. And then the second thing is I think I'd like to understand, and some of this we can do on our own, but I think it would be, I'd like to prompt some thought to the developer because they might have an interesting idea about this at how it addresses the town's liability for the buildings. And so if you're going to make a partial proposal, what is the combination of cash consideration that you're offering with buildings that you're taking off the town's balance sheet? And how does that affect the overall mix, and what are we left with? And does part of that proposal address that liability issue, right? Assuming again, and I use this number because I think it's the high number that we use, the $25 million liability for demolition of the buildings, which I see as sort of the town's liability for those buildings, and where we carried on the balance sheet. And so if it's a partial proposal, what does it do to that liability? So when we're evaluating a partial proposal against complete proposals that presumably would take the entirety of that liability off the town's balance sheet, and hopefully replace it with something resembling an asset or a neutral, kind of something neutral financially, what does it do to that? Because I do think for developers who might look at it and say, I really don't think we can do the whole thing. Here, we can do this partial piece of this. It'll leave you with this situation. And we know we don't have to tear the buildings down next week or next year, or maybe not in 10 years. So, but it is a liability. It's an unfunded liability that we have. And so if there's going to be a partial proposal, which again, I would welcome, and I think we ought to encourage within the zoning that exists, how does that affect our liability? How does the developer plan to deal with that? Do they say, look, we will, as part of this plan, we'll buy this piece of the land, we'll take these buildings off your hand, and oh, by the way, as part of our project, we'll also demolish these other 6 buildings for you that are the worst ones, right? So we can do that cheaper than you. We'll do that as part of this whole thing. We'll bid it out together, and we'll take the 6 worst buildings off your hands. And then here's where your liability is on the far side of this. So that was sort of the second, conceptual point, but a specific ask of the developer.
I could maybe, Todd, if you want, I'll react, and then you again might have a reaction here. I think the way that my understanding of the wording we have in the RFP was to leave open the possibility that a developer could come in to only propose to redevelop a portion of the property. In our discussions, as I recall, we wanted to guard against a developer coming in and saying, oh, I'll do the arboretum because I can just, plow everything down. The core thing we're dealing with here is the quad. And you could probably say in the buildings on the west slope that kind of are connected with it. So the RFP itself was written with the intention of making it possible for a developer to just propose a certain amount of, to redevelop a portion, but with a preference that we would have a developer that would kind of take on the bulk of this so that we don't get involved in trying to referee multiple sub-developers and no overarching developer. We hadn't talked a lot. I think that you're talking a little differently about a partial development though, Mike. We've kind of talked, I think, about partial developers coming in for a part of the site in the spirit of thinking of a jigsaw puzzle where you partition it up in a way that the developers would like to propose on it, but you're trying to craft an overall plan. And I think primarily an overall plan for the quad, and then maybe secondarily the west slope, but not like, oh, I'm going to take the northeast corner of the quad and you've got all the rest of these. You're raising the idea that we might not get any developer wanting to develop a portion of this, but we might find a developer that wants to develop a portion. We like that idea. It's just that we get stuck with an orphan piece of land that nobody wanted to take on. And Todd, I don't think we've really played that scenario out too much.
Well, let me clarify here. So, I mean, just to clarify before Todd responds. So I am not talking about the jigsaw puzzle. So to me, if it's going to be a complete development, it's got to be one developer. So we should not be in the position of refereeing multiple developers and essentially taking on the role of being the master developer or the supervisor of the site. If we're going to redevelop the whole site, then it should be a single developer who's going to take responsibility for the whole site. The town should not get in the business of overseeing 4 different developers who want to do different pieces of it. If they want to make a joint proposal and it's going to all be together and we're going to deal with one joint venture and that joint venture is going to be all that is fine, but we can't be in the position of being the master developer of the property. What I'm talking about is that the best offer we get is to develop a portion of the property, and that's all we're going to do here in 2021. We're not going to do a jigsaw puzzle. We're going to do 35 acres of development, and we're going to do 52 acres left as is for now, to be dealt with in another day. And how does that proposal look financially for the town? How does that proposal look overall compared to the various proposals we're going to get? We're going to get potentially, hopefully, various proposals for the development of the whole site. So I would be against a jigsaw puzzle. I would be against us having 4 different contracts or 4 different dispositions. If it's the whole site, it's got to be one developer who's responsible for the whole site. But I would be interested in getting proposals for a portion of the site, and that being the only thing we're going to do in this particular disposition process.
Right. So what I would say is that the RFP attempts to be very flexible, and the goal is to attract development proposals, right? And ideally, we get multiple proposals for the entire site. We may or may not get that. We may get some of those and 1 or 2 proposals that relate to only a portion of the site. And what I'm hearing from your comments, Mike, and I think, it is a good point, is that it's better for the there's a liability question for the town, and it's better for the town if as close to 100% of that liability problem that can get solved through any kind of disposition at the hospital, then the better. So if somebody's coming in and they're only proposing a portion, that's less attractive than the entire site, and those developers who are proposing a portion should therefore be asked, how are you going to solve this other problem?
Right. But it also encourages them to think about, would I rather develop 35 acres, which I know I can do profitably with lower infrastructure costs, with lower issues on these buildings, and I'd rather just pay cash in lieu of kind of taking on this other liability for those buildings. I'll pay the town cash for this portion of it. The town will get cash that can be held against that liability over time and as needed, dealing with the removal of those buildings. The developer may just say, look, I don't want the, as I've called it before, right, the $500 million solution to a $25 million problem, right? So a developer may say, look, I have an idea here for a piece of this, and we want that developer to tell us, okay, so we understand, how are we dealing with our $25 million problem? Are we going to still have a $25 million problem on the back end? Then that's no reason to do that, right? Or are we then going to have a $5 million problem? Or are we going to have additional money against that problem going forward, such that we can manage the buildings accordingly? Like, I think we all agree that if it costs $500,000 to demolish the buildings, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? It wouldn't be no reason to do this development. If we didn't own this property, we wouldn't be coming up with this proposal and saying, where can we put this in town, right? I mean, this is driven by the fact that we want to control our destiny at the hospital. We want to make the best use of it that we can for the overall benefit of the town. And we're doing it against the backdrop of a significant liability to the town for these buildings, a long-term liability, not a short-term liability, right, over time. And so that's what I'm getting at, that we don't want to have proposals that don't solve any part of our $25 million problem. But I think we should encourage developers to look at it and say, if part of what we're trying to solve for here is this $25 million problem, and the town ends up with a chunk of this property kind of as is, right, still open to the public, people still walking their dogs there, and we do have a development on a piece of it, then again, consistent with the zoning, consistent with the aim of the master plan, just not the whole thing. How does that look financially? So they can tell us, right? That's something that they're going to think about, and then the developers can weigh on their end, right? Okay, because I mean, I'm just remembering back to sort of the master planning committees, the building by building analysis, and profitable in this building and not profitable in that building, and kind of all of it together. And, you know, part of the consideration that the town is going to get from a developer who takes the whole property is the developer taking on buildings that aren't going to be profitable on their own. Right. And so part of what we're getting is, you know, they're going to get certain buildings that they can do better with and certain they can do worse with. And that's part of how we're going to get paid. Right. Assuming that somebody who takes the whole property is not going to write a massive check up front for something that's consistent with what we're talking about. And I'm saying, let's get the developers thinking about a different way to address that financial picture, and maybe leaving us with a development on a portion, and a portion left for another day, and left for kind of the use and the benefit of the town, you know, into the future, with some security that we're not going to be sticking the taxpayers 5 years from now with a giant demolition bill if the buildings suddenly have to be dealt with, you know, on a timetable that I don't think we anticipate at the moment.
So I think for me, the big thing is to have flexibility, and hopefully we'll get all kinds of interesting proposals from developers. You know, if people want to bid on 35 acres, I'm fine with their doing that. And my preference would be to have them take on the whole project. In my mind, there's no way at all that the town can become the master developer at all. So that's just off the table in my mind. We don't have the ability to handle that sort of thing. And so that my preference would be if some developer would take all of it and deal with all of it for us. And if we can get some sort of increase in the commercial part, it's great. I mean, it might have to go back to a town meeting for a different zoning change if we really like a proposal that deviates from the zoning. And I'm certainly open to doing that. I mean, since the reuse plan was created, the town has basically solved its affordable housing. We're virtually at 10% at this point, and on a track to get to 10%. So one of the big drivers of the reuse plan was all of the affordable housing that was built into it. And so that we don't necessarily need that. I mean, it's not a bad thing, maybe, but you know,
we need some. We need
about 8 or something.
We can't declare a victory on that one yet. I mean, we still have to move in that direction. So I don't think we should discount it.
And as a practical
it's different
matter,
than it was 4 years ago.
As a practical matter, if we put housing up there at all, the inclusionary zoning will get us some, even if it's not first and foremost affordable housing. I want to come back, you know, react to your comments, Mike, and yours, Pete. I don't think the committee, Todd, we've had this discussion, but I don't think the committee has ever pointed in the direction of the town being a master developer. But I do want to raise the kind of scenario I think that we did consider that I actually think we should be open to. And let me give you a simple example. You could have a developer that would, as you know, the hospital property is broken out into separate areas. I could conceive of a developer coming in saying, I'd like to basically redevelop the core campus, and have another developer come in and say, well, I don't know how, you know, I don't want to go hip deep into this thing, but I'd like to redevelop the buildings on the west slope. And I could see us having it to our advantage as a town to issue 2 development contracts, not because we're the master developer of a master plan to get the whole thing done, but we would allow 2 developers to take on different parts of this because they do fit together and it does make sense. I have a harder time picturing a developer who would say, listen, I just want the southwest corner of the quad, and I want you to, you know, and as far as I'm concerned, you can leave the other 3/4 of the buildings in the quad as they are. I just can't picture a developer thinking it's a great idea to fix up a couple of buildings with a bunch of.
No, I think the developer would take the portion closest to Chapel Hill Landing, closest to the road, running up towards the core campus. I mean, that's the most easily developable, least expensive part of the.
No, you have to. You're going to wind up having to develop buildings.
No, I know, and that's why I say if you're going to make that kind of proposal, you have to tell us how that relates to how you deal with the liability for the buildings. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, well,
Because there's a number that somebody would pay for that would effectively deal with the buildings, right? And I don't know that they would pay that number for it, but there's the equivalent of dealing with the buildings that way, or in some combination. And that's what I'm getting at, that I agree with you, Gus. Like, we can't just say, look, we're going to develop no buildings. It doesn't do anything for us, right? But if you're going to have a different kind of a mix, I'll take 6 buildings and I'll take that area there because I can put some new stuff there. Okay, there's got to be cash coming with that, right? Because you've got to have some then security against the liability of the buildings. And that's what I'm getting at. For someone who wants to make that kind of proposal, we want them thinking in that way. All right, that if I'm not bidding on the whole thing, the town still has this liability issue on the buildings. And so part of the consideration, or part of the way we're going to deal with this, is how do we deal with your liability issue on these buildings? Yeah,
that's fine. The other, I see Bill Massaro is on the meeting, but I haven't seen any comments from him yet. I think the one, I'm guessing here, channeling Bill, the other point that he would bring out, your point's totally valid, Mike, and that's something we probably haven't talked about. But the other piece of it is the agreement we have with the state as a function of how much of the land we actually transfer as part of this. So you get into another thing here where if some developer came in and just wanted a couple of buildings, that probably doesn't help us at all on the splitting of the expenses we've incurred so far, because there wouldn't probably be a whole lot of the out of the open space land. Not the stuff, not that it would be developed, but basically the way the provisions are right now, it's quite, we have had discussions about, we might actually want the developer to take that open land, recognizing it can't be changed. See Bill's posting, he said DCAM would be thrilled to get anything, but I'm thinking of I want to be thrilled that we get most of what we plowed in back after all these years. They would be able to build on it, but they might actually want to have control of it. And we would want them to have control of it from a maintenance standpoint and from a financial standpoint.
Right. So, I mean, I would just kind of jump in and say that, nobody on the committee thinks the town should be the master developer. So that's not even something that needs to be discussed. Version 1 of the RFP kind of took the position that if you're bidding, you have to address the whole site. And part of that was we thought we'd get to more robust discussion kind of from that state. That might not be the right answer in the end, but in the beginning to sort of think through what this really means. And I think there was a shift between version 1 and version 2 to recognizing, our goal here is to attract development proposals. We don't know what we're going to get. We want to maintain flexibility. The idea would be to deal with the entire site and all of the liability. And, as proposals come in, there's room for negotiation on the part of the town. There's room to marry up developers. That's pretty common in the development world. We like this about your proposal and that about yours. You guys go off and come back to us with a plan about, how you can do this as a joint venture. So, we're trying to signal flexibility and look to work with interested and capable developers who make a response.
And I don't know that anyone is explicitly going to say we're going to become the master developer. My fear is we back into it. So in Gus's scenario, where you have 2 developers who want to work together, I think there'd be one contract that would govern that, and how they're going to work together and who's responsible for what would be resolved up front. And there wouldn't be any refereeing or decisions for the town to make. They would be off doing what they're doing, and we would oversee it as a regulatory matter and in the town's role as a regulator. But we would not be in the situation of developer A coming to us and saying, well, we want to put the road here, and developer B saying, I want to go here. And so you, town, now sort this out, or we want to use this material or that material, or this thing they're going to put on there is going to block our sun, or who knows, right? I mean, it's those kind of things that we don't want to be in the business of doing. And so I agree. Nobody's explicitly say we're going to be the master developer, but the more people who are involved, the more of a refereeing role we're going to have to take on. That's my concern.
I take comfort from the fact that there's at least 3 really smart lawyers on this call. So that stand between receipt of proposals.
You shouldn't sit that comfortably on that basis. You shouldn't sit that comfortably on that basis, Todd. All right, that's all I have, other than I would say my most important comment on page 17, to note there are also baseball fields at McCarthy, not just soccer, softball, and lacrosse fields. And so let's no short shrift to baseball, please. And then I assume we'll get to the Medfield Energy Committee comments at some point as well. So that's what I had. Thanks very much for this. I think that those are my two main issues. So.
Okay, and maybe just one more comment since you mentioned it. We did receive comments from Jim Nail on Friday. They will be discussed at the Development Committee meeting tomorrow night. Jim has been great to work with and has given us something that I think is in line with what we expected. We might have some tweaking here and there, but that's been a good discussion throughout, and it seems like from our perspective, we're in a good place.
Let me just ask: Are you going to include his appendix as an appendix to the RFP? Well, is that just something to be discussed later? No,
we suggested that they provide us with an appendix, which is what Jim has done. So I think there'll be some discussion of whether we'd like to see some edits, but we specifically invited that feedback. So yes, the intention is to include an appendix.
All right. So I've covered most of the things already that I wanted to talk about. So why don't we see if the public listening has some comments or questions, and I guess the process for that is to somehow Chris is going to figure out who's got questions and promote them to ask their question.
If you have a question or comment this evening, just put your name and address in the Q&A section and we'll recognize you to speak.
The Energy Committee does have somebody from New Ecology, Lauren, somebody or other that they want to have address us, I think. New Ecology was the consultant that the Energy Committee was working with to figure things out.
Fred and Jim, you can speak.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Hi, this is Jim Nail from the Energy
Hi, it's
Committee.
Fred Davis.
And Fred Davis. Great. Okay, Fred, you want to take it away first, and then I'll draft in behind you.
Great, and we didn't expect this kind of segue, so thanks for mentioning, Todd, that you're going to be taking up the Jim's comments, which the selectmen are going to hear tonight. So the background from the Energy Committee's point of view is all of the above considerations and all of the considerations that we heard listening to many of the MSHDC committee deliberations. We took them all into account in terms of putting our recommendations forward. But further, it's climate emergency. Climate emergency, unfortunately, comes into everything from here forward. And my comments to the Board of Selectmen back on January 5th dealt with this in detail. I won't go over those details again, but they do tie in here. As you may remember, we submitted a resolution 13 months ago now to have input to this process, and I appreciate that Todd has given opportunity for us to do so. But at this point, and maybe tomorrow night things will change, but at this point there are some particulars that are not in the draft as far as I know, and some of those are not just nice, but from our perspective, necessary, not just nice. So the core of that might be EUIs, and Jim will be talking about EUIs in a minute. They're like miles per gallon for a building, efficiency of a building, EUIs. And as
Fred, can I just interrupt you for 1 second with a question? This is Mike. Is this stuff that's in addition to the materials you provided in writing?
I'm sorry, Mike, I couldn't quite hear you.
So we got a number of written comments and a draft appendix and all of that stuff. Are the comments you're making now, is this in addition to the stuff that you provided in writing for
Correct.
Potential edits to the RFP?
Correct.
Okay.
And I'm going to start and end with saying that Lauren, as Jim's and Pete just mentioned, Lauren Bauman is here. She is a respected professional in this field, probably the top person, one of the top people in our region. And it's great if you get to hear a few words from her. She will emphasize that the kinds of recommendations we're making for the RFP are not extreme in any way. They are expected by developers these days. And that's core. I hope you will hear that clearly. So again, I want to frame this in terms of a climate emergency. And Mike, just the documents that we did forward do have to do with the brand new governor's 2030 and 2050 documents, a couple hundred pages worth of documents. That's not, in the, we gave you a summary of that, but the point is that came in just, we reviewed them just after the last time we met with you on January 5th. And they form the framework really for everything that has to go forward in order for us to meet the state mandate, in order for the state to meet the state mandated 2050 goals. Net zero new construction is necessary from here forward. Net zero new construction is necessary. That's why I keep saying not nice, but necessary. So Mike, thanks for pointing out, yes, there's a lot of other material that we did put into the packet, and thank you for mentioning that. I don't know how you three get through all that material every couple of weeks, more power to you. But please come back to the Energy Committee with any questions or comments. We will keep coming to you because there's so many ways in which energy and carbon intersect everything that the municipality has to be looking at. So again, Jim, I think you're next, and then Lauren after that.
Okay, thanks, Fred.
Thank you very
Fred,
much.
Go ahead, Jim.
Fred, can I just,
Sure, go ahead,
want to
Gus.
have a quick follow-up with Fred. When you say this is a state mandate, net zero new construction, you are stating that a law has been passed in this state that requires all new construction to be net zero?
Very good point. And just because the governor put out these hundreds of pages of documents doesn't make it law. You're correct, Gus.
Okay.
It does. There's a key point in there about new construction, page 40 of the buildings document. That one by itself was a couple hundred pages. Anyway, in that it goes through when will this be mandated? Well, when will net zero be a mandated part of building code? And it doesn't say when that happens because it's not up to the governor per se. And Lauren may be able to comment on this more, but it gives two scenarios and basically says if we have to wait till 2030 for such a code to be in place, it makes a huge difference compared to if it was implemented in 2023. In other words, it goes through those two scenarios. So in 2 years from now or in 9 years from now, huge difference. And the big difference would probably be, or this development would be part of that big difference because it is so big. So that's a partial answer for you, Gus, but thanks for bringing it up. And Jim and Lauren will probably give you further perspectives on that.
Okay.
Jim, you want to take it then?
I certainly will. And Todd, I just want to thank you for the kind words up front. I've enjoyed working with you, and I'm very appreciative of the language in this version of the RFP that talks about, going forward, how you'll seek our advice and reactions to the proposals going forward. So the four areas of the RFP that I submitted comments for, they really kind of boil down to two main topics. And one is there were like three places where I wanted to change the language around things like energy conservation technologies and general energy stuff and make it talk about having a comprehensive plan for the property to address that. Because that's what I think is really going to differentiate the developers on their knowledge and experience and ability to address our concerns on the energy. Anybody can say we'll put in all Energy Star appliances. Who cares? We're going to get high efficiency gas boilers. Who cares? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about someone who's going to think much more holistically about the property, which does go back to the 2050 roadmap that Fred just mentioned, which may become law. There is a bill in the legislature right now that was passed last session, vetoed by the governor. It was repassed immediately in the new session. Baker has sent it back to the legislature with some comments and requested changes, so that process is in negotiation. But quite frankly, it passed by enough that they could override the veto if they wanted to. So it's likely to become law. But specifically in that, if I boiled down that whole plan, that whole roadmap, it really comes down to three things. It comes down to high efficiency buildings, both new construction and then retrofitting existing housing and building stock. No fossil fuels. There's a very explicit statement that the use of fossil fuels has to decline fairly rapidly. And then third, related to that, is then electrifying everything, including the heating of buildings. So that's the kind of thinking I'll be looking for from the developers, and I would like that to be very explicit in the document. And again, there were like three places where that would be helpful.
And Jim, this is Mike. Just a quick question: is this different than the comments that you provided in writing?
No.
Oh, the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. That they're going to discuss tomorrow night.
I'm fleshing out a little bit of the rationale there. And then the last one is the inclusion of explicit mention of the existing district energy infrastructure on the site. It's not the type of thing a developer would normally expect to see, so they wouldn't be looking for it. And yet the fact that it's there, both from an energy standpoint, but maybe, even solving some of the infrastructure issues that we know is a big challenge to developing the site, could be helpful. I don't know whether it'd be helpful, but certainly worth bringing it to their attention, letting them look at it, and letting them see if that is something useful.
Hey, Jim, if I could interrupt on that point, have you talked to John Thompson or any of the people that are kind of technically familiar with the site to get any indication of the likelihood that could be useful?
Yes. And again, no one has, been down in there. I don't believe they've sent even any cameras down in there. So it is a bit of an unknown what condition they're in. But chances are, even if they had to excavate them and open them up, that may be easier, less expensive to do than digging all new trenches everywhere.
John has been through some of the tunnels.
Yeah.
I know, but I don't know about the ones between the buildings, but certainly from the power plant up to the site, I think he has actually.
Yeah. So those are those comments. Any other questions on those comments? Because I want to just say a quick word about the appendix and particularly the EUIs, and that's why Lauren's here, because I know there is still concern about those EUIs and having specific numbers that developers have to aim for. And I just want to reassure you, and Lauren can explain as well, that these are very realistic, very achievable, and I think I've used the phrase before. Yes, a little aggressive, but still within the realm of what's very doable with current technology. We're not, aiming for the stars here.
And Jim, is that comment directed toward new construction or
Both.
19th century rehabilitation of buildings?
Both. Because New Ecology has been involved in a number of those kind of renovation projects of old mills and old structures like that. And so the rehab EUIs we put in there were based on some of their experience and some of what they've observed they've been able to do in those buildings. And if you'd like to, can open it up and Lauren can describe a little bit more of that.
I think the one thing that I would be, if in fact New Ecology has examples of that, my next question would be, does New Ecology have estimates of what it costs to do? What the impact on, in other words, what the impact on a rehab cost for the kind of buildings we're talking, what that financial impact is.
So I guess what I would suggest, Jim, is if you want to finish off your comments about the appendix, and then we can go on to Lauren.
That's, pretty much my comments on the appendix, actually.
All right, very good. Lauren,
Thank
thank
you,
you
Jim.
for coming.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. Lauren Bellman from New Ecology. It's been a pleasure working with the Energy Committee as they've put together the information for the RFP. So Jim and Fred asked me to be here to talk a little bit more about those EUIs and just context for them. And
sure. So maybe you could, Lauren, could you start out by explaining who you are and who New Ecology is?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So New Ecology is a Boston-based nonprofit organization that works with developers to help them implement sustainable energy efficient development. So just to give you a little bit of a sense, we work on approximately 100 development projects a year with many of the developers that you're courting for this site in terms of cost effectively implementing energy efficiency, sustainability, and resiliency measures. Obviously over the last 10 years or so, those issues have become much, much more urgent. There are more aggressive standards around it in many municipalities as well as at the state level. And so we've been working with developers to help them come up with ways to cost effectively implement these strategies. We do quite a lot of work on affordable housing. So we're very used to the constraints and limitations associated with the budgets associated with those projects. And so that's really some of the context that we bring to the conversation. And as Jim was mentioning before, in terms of the thresholds that the EUI thresholds and targets that we set for the historic buildings, those are more challenging, absolutely. Obviously, there's a lot of unknowns there as it relates to what will be allowed to be happening on those sites in terms of energy conservation measures related to the historic restrictions for the tax credits there. But what we did to develop those targets was essentially look at a couple of projects that we redeveloped with some large developers that were very similar to this approximately 10 years ago. So these are projects, that have been around for a while, probably an earlier generation of technology and approach. And what I can tell you is that the threshold EUIs that were set for the historic buildings, both of the projects that we looked at that were historic rehabs, both state and federal tax credits applied, were able to get to that threshold. And that was approximately 10 years ago. So we feel really confident that the threshold numbers that we've set here are extremely achievable. The targets are much more aggressive, right? So those are where we're expecting folks to push a little bit more. And we're hoping that these thresholds and targets will actually help you all differentiate developers a little bit, in terms of the commitments that they're making. And if they can show examples from their portfolio of projects that they've worked on where they've been able to achieve performance metrics on projects like this. So that gives you a little bit of sense on the historic side and how we came to those numbers. In terms of the new construction side of things, again, the threshold EUIs are better than what stretch code would require by not by much. Our projects are routinely hitting these numbers in communities that are stretch code communities where they're thinking strategically and early about energy efficiency and sustainability. So again, threshold EUI, it gets people thinking about these issues and really figuring out how they get there, but they're not super aggressive. The target EUIs that we've listed here are the more aggressive targets. Those are the targets that projects that are pursuing things like passive house certification would potentially get to. Another thing that we've seen a huge increase in the number of developers taking on in the last couple of years. For example, we're working on about 25 multifamily new construction, passive house new construction projects at this point, again, with many of the developers that we would expect to be applying for this RFP.
So one of my goals for this project is to get the best possible result out of it for the town for the long run. And one of the things that fascinated me when I heard somebody talk about passive house was that the people that lived in the buildings that were built to passive house in the multifamily passive house structures, the environment was so much pleasanter. It was so much quieter, and the heat was so much more uniform that the landlords were finding that there was less turnover. And
yeah, that's absolutely true. So because of the way that the buildings approach the thermal envelope and unit compartmentalization, you benefit from an energy perspective, but also from a sound mitigation perspective. And so, for example, we've heard developers saying that they can develop properties that were previously considered undevelopable, close to railroad lines, where decibel levels were too high. But if they approach it from a passive house perspective, it totally changes that equation. Passive house program also has very specific requirements around indoor air quality and environmental quality. And so all of those things are really rigorously looked at for that. The great news about the passive house certification is also that the Mass Save program at the state level has just released very lucrative incentives to support developers in implementing this. So almost $3,000 per unit in incentive, as well as some soft cost subsidy to help them offset the cost of pursuing passive house redevelopment on their projects. So the combination of that and, for example, at the state level, the housing DHCD providing additional competitive points to affordable housing projects that are pursuing passive house in their tax credit applications has just led to a boom in multifamily passive house projects in the last year and a half. And it's one that we hope that you'll benefit from in terms of being able to implement some of those on this redevelopment.
any questions, Gus? You're on mute.
Always forget. Lauren, the potential for passive house that you're talking about here applies to remodeled old buildings or new construction?
My expectation is that you'd see it more aggressively applied by developers on the new construction side of things. It's definitely going to be more achievable. Not to say it's impossible on the historic rehab side of things. So, I'm aware currently of a project that's just about to go into construction. It's moving towards closing in Fitchburg that they've been redeveloping. It's a historic building, historic tax credit at both the federal and the state level that will be pursuing passive house certification. And so, that team's actually been coordinating very specifically with the Park Service at the federal level to get windows approved that will fit in and be approved on the historic as well as the energy side of things. And so we're seeing movement towards higher and higher performance historic rehabilitation. But my expectation is that on this site specifically, it will be most easily achievable on the new construction side of things. And then on the historic rehab side of things, again, even if teams aren't pursuing that level of passive house certification, we think there's a tremendous amount of potential to really improve the energy performance of those existing buildings. It's actually quite critical in terms of just the occupant comfort of the folks who will end up living there. We have to make sure that those will be comfortable living environments that are affordable from an energy use perspective.
So the reason I asked the question is this particular redevelopment is primarily not new construction. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to get calibrated on how I should understand this conversation. It's possible that there could be some new construction over in the Arboretum area, depending on how the proposals come in, but the prime interest is in the campus and probably the West Slope, which is all going to be rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. I just bring that out so you know what's probably most helpful to hear from you tonight.
No, absolutely. And I think that's been the expectation, is that it will likely be a mix, but that, for the new construction buildings, it's very achievable and realistic to approach it from a passive house perspective. If there are new construction buildings proposed from the historic rehab side, you really do want developers thinking early and often about how they're going to meld together the historic requirements to get the tax credits on that side, because that's so critical to funding these projects, with how they're going to make these buildings that will survive into the next century, right? And that they're not going to have to retrofit in 20 years because there are new regulations around carbon neutrality. So, this is the time for these buildings to get their energy upgrades and to do it really very very consciously from the very beginning.
Thanks.
Mike, questions?
I don't really have questions. I appreciate all the information. I've read all the stuff that's been provided. I think I understand the issues here. I think, Gus, to your point about the rehab versus the new construction, I do think the more we push in, obviously we're not required to rehab the buildings, right? By any of our agreements, it's preferred. It's encouraged. It's got to be considered and all the rest of it, but it's not required. I mean, I think anything we do push in this direction, the further you push in this direction, the more I think you might see proposals for essentially replacing the buildings as opposed to simply rehabbing them. And I don't know how that all plays out and the rest of it. And obviously we have to comply with our obligations with the historical and everybody else. But I think there's obviously a trade-off there between historical preservation and energy efficiency. And I do think that it would, the higher priority that is given to this overall. And I generally found the comments that were provided in advance of the meeting to be reasonable, subject to any comments from the development committee based on their expertise. I think you'll see developers trying to figure out a way to have more new buildings be a part of it rather than purely rehab. But I think we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, this is Jim again. I wanted to just jump back in, go one click deeper on how we got to these EUIs, Gus, just to reassure you on a couple of things. The Energy Star program runs an online system called Portfolio Manager. And a lot of building owners use Portfolio Manager to track their energy use. Energy Star then aggregates that data and publishes what are the EUIs of various different building types. And they correlate to the different building uses on the campus. So you'll see in the appendix, there's a table there which lists the different building uses and lists those EUIs. So what we did is the Energy Star program publishes the median EUI. And so we took that and said, let's go, median means every single building in the system, which can mean a lot of old inefficient buildings as well as new efficient buildings. So we can definitely do better than median. So for the threshold, I think that's about a 20% better than median. And then the target is like 33% median. To go
Jim,
back to, yeah, sure.
I just want to make sure I understood what you said. The median that you're talking about there is a median of rehabbed buildings or a median of all buildings?
It's a median of all buildings in the Portfolio Manager program.
So on what basis are you assuming that would be relevant to rehabbing buildings, like the ones we have?
Again, because there is a mix of old, very inefficient buildings as well as new. So when you look at that mix, that median is pretty representative of what's out there. And to go back to that miles per gallon analogy that Fred alluded to. So the median, so that's like the average miles per gallon of a car. So an average miles per gallon of a car today is 26 miles per gallon. So when we say we want an EUI that's 20% better than that, we're saying, okay, we're looking for cars that get 30 miles per gallon. There's a lot of cars out there that get 30 miles per gallon and better. The other thing, Gus, though, that also in 2010, the state did an eQuest energy model of Building 23 and then used that to extrapolate the campus. And they achieved a 36 EUI at 2010 building code. And then they got to a 31 EUI by going a little bit above code. So that's the 2010.
So let me just quick jump in on this, because my analogy for the median would be, we have a Model T Ford and we have a database of speeds 0 to 60 that range from the Tesla all the way down to some Model Ts and some 1950 VW Bugs. And we took a median, and we're saying we're pretty sure we can get Model T Fords to get to that median. I would have felt better if we'd had Model T Fords, Model A Fords, a couple of other cars from that era, and said, you know, the best ones were able to do this. That's more like the median. So if you can understand my concern about the base of what you're saying there. But what I heard from Lauren was something that was more important, which she said there was a project that she was involved in 10 years ago with a rehab that was able to meet a threshold.
That's right.
That threshold higher or lower than the one that you're targeting as a threshold, not a target, but as a threshold.
Right. So those two projects, so they're two historic rehab projects in communities, very similar. They all achieve better than that 50 EUI threshold that we listed. So again, 10 years ago, able to hit this threshold, and that is actual measured performance. So that is us tracking the utility bills at these sites and calculating an EUI based on those utility bills.
So that would be a reference for me that I wouldn't have any hesitation about accepting as a good spot. Now, Jim, I think I'm not worried about targets. I'm only worried about thresholds.
Gus, as I understand what Jim is telling us is that the database in Portfolio Manager is huge. I mean, it includes all Medfield's municipal buildings, including the Dale Street School, which obviously is totally inefficient at this point.
But Pete, I'm saying those are all irrelevant to a 19th century building.
I think what he said was that his threshold EUIs were 20% above the median of everything in the Portfolio Manager. So it's a pretty low threshold. Given the fact that those buildings are anywhere up to 100 years old in the Portfolio Manager, so it's not a huge stretch.
Yeah, I'm willing to set aside those if you are concerned about those, and go back to the eQuest model that the state did in 2010 that said they could achieve a 36 at building code in 2010, and we're saying a 50. Now, the reason we're saying a 50 is we're giving some leeway because presumably the state was not planning on using historic tax credits. So they were probably planning just gut the whole thing and do whatever they wanted to. We're going to 50 to say, just in case there are some interior features that have to be preserved and we're not able to do all the insulation we could do otherwise, we're going to give them a little bit more leeway on that threshold in those rehabs. And again, that 50, as Lauren described, is numbers she has seen in similar kinds of buildings. So we've tried to be very realistic here.
And Jim, I'm not actually arguing over numbers here. I'm trying to be sure I understand how you get to the numbers that you have. So I'm just trying to understand the process. I'm not trying to negotiate it. Okay. That's answered my questions. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Okay, Jim and Lauren, anything more for us?
I'm done, and I know it's getting late, but as you all know, we are here to answer questions and continue this conversation throughout the process.
Well,
So
we appreciate you doing it. It sounds like you're going to be at the development committee this week too. So thanks for that.
Thank you both. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks very much.
Appreciate your coming. We appreciate your colleague Margie, who served on our energy committee for a while until he moved out of town. Chris, is anybody else lined up to talk to us? Where's Bill Massaro?
Bill has indicated he is not ready to speak just yet.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Fred.
So just from a process standpoint, the development committee is going to meet tomorrow night. Is the idea then coming out of that meeting that the development committee will present us with the RFP they think we ought to issue and ask that we vote to issue it? Is that where we are?
Yes.
Okay.
And I would say, a lot of the discussion, I would say, some of the comments that have been received since version 2, are probably more in the way of editorial and are not going to require, any airtime at the meeting tomorrow night. But I think some of the larger discussions around scoring and, town liability, the role of the guidelines that NBC has suggested, I would expect those to be the main points. Commercial, encouraging commercial use. Those are probably the major items. I mean, a lot of the comments that we have received, even on version 2, have kind of been within the 4 corners of what we're working with, and just either tightening it up or, just finishing up on things like exhibits and maps and things of that nature. So, as I said earlier, I think as a technical matter, Mass Historic has until March 3rd to get back to us. So we're not really expecting significant comments there, but we'd like to be ready to go, when that period ends.
Mike and Pete, speaking for myself, the one piece about this process that it took me a while to really understand well enough is this review is to get an RFP out to try to drum up support from qualified developers and get interesting ideas. It's not actually the last, it's not pulling the final trigger, if you will. If we get good proposals in, there will be a process of negotiating, revising, reacting to, and further negotiating. So speaking personally, I went into this thinking of this as, okay, this is the RFP that will lead to the contract. And then as I've been at the committee meetings and talked with the folks on the committee and with Bev, I realized actually, no, this is a serious proposal to get, ideas from developers that we can then identify the developers that seem like they're offering the most attractive possibilities to the town, that we can then further refine to get at what it is we really want. So it's, I know for me, that helped me be a little more relaxed about not having every single, thing buttoned down tight, because it's not that way.
Yep, I appreciate Todd's statement that it's intended to be a flexible document. That I think we want to create a large funnel to get whatever creative ideas we can get for the place and see what's of interest to us.
Right, and I guess, just to tack on to that, I think, we've, on the part of the committee, been careful to not be too prescriptive in any one area or create minimums that might have the effect of discouraging responses or just, sort of submission requirement overload that, otherwise busy developers feel is going to be too complicated. I think, it's not unheard of to have a 50 or 55 page RFP, plus exhibits. But if you go back and look at the Westboro State Hospital one, it's 7 or 8 pages. So, I think
that was a simple one though. If we wanted to do what they did in Westboro, ours could be 5 pages too.
Well, I'm just saying that the amount of time and effort that's gone in, I think, has given us a document that's tried to accommodate a lot of different issues without creating a bar that's so high it will have the unintended effect of discouraging actual responses.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the work the committee's done. You guys have put a lot of time into this, and I really appreciate the effort. So,
and we're fortunate to have such qualified professionals leading the group for us. So thank you.
I think there's some excitement that there's a 120-day response time for developers, and it might create a little window to maybe not have a meeting for a while. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to address you tonight.
Thanks, Todd.
So Todd, I'll just share with you that when we were doing the original deal with the state, we actually had 5 selectmen meetings in 1 week. The state legislature was going out of business, and we had to get it done before they disappeared for another session. Was going to be 2 years or something. So there was a lot to do at the end. So we had 5 meetings in 1 week.
Wow.
That's still the record for me.
Yeah, right. And here we are poring over the documents you signed. At the end of that, right? Standing the test of time.
Yeah.
Todd.
Good night.
Thank you, Todd.
Thanks again. So I guess we have our discussion area coming up next, and that starts with COVID-19 status update and CARES funding update. Anything, Chris?
So yeah, I'll actually take 2, 3, and 4 all at once. So
Okay.
in terms of our CARES funding, the CARES money has been expended at this point. That was the 1.1 million we received. We're still in the reconciliation phase, and there's been some changes with the new administration as to how that money can be used. So we're still working on whether or not some of that CARES money can be applied to FEMA and vice versa. So we'll keep you updated on that.
Yep. And for the folks at home, when you say it was extended, it had to be spent by last December originally, and they gave us more time to spend it.
Correct. And originally we were only going to receive 75% reimbursement from FEMA. And now that's 100%. So that will free up, could free up a small amount of money for CARES for additional. So we're tracking that as well. We're in the process currently of running budget scenarios to present to you next week. We've been in the process of receiving some positive news in terms of our local receipts and health insurance. I don't have anything official to share with you this evening, but should have some more solid information by next Monday at least. In terms of the warrant articles, on February 16th, we closed the warrant at 5 o'clock and we had 50 warrant articles. I'm pleased to inform you that we have lost a few along the way in the last week and a half, so we should have less than 50 by the time we get to town meeting. So we're getting there, just a little slower than usual. That's just it for the budget update for this evening.
Okay. And action items, committee appointments. We want to appoint Marge Basitaro to the Board of Registrars for a 1-year term and appoint Jennifer Keating to the Board of Registrars for a 3-year term.
Correct.
Do we have a motion to that effect?
I would move that we appoint Margaret Vasuduro to the Board of Registrars for a 1-year term and Jennifer Keating to the Board of Registrars for a 3-year term. Oh, Gus has to unmute.
That was all set for that second.
Mr. Peterson?
Yep.
Mr. Murby?
Yes.
And Mr. Marcucci, yes.
And next we have need to vote to sign the warrant for the town election that is going to be on March 29, 2021.
I would just note on this one, you probably noticed that you've got to.
It's the coup, and you're not supposed to talk about the coup.
So we'll fix that.
We caught him red-handed. It's been changed.
Okay, we'll fix that. And then I would move to, I guess, to authorize us to sign the warrant for the annual town election.
Second.
Mr. Peterson?
Yep.
Mr. Murby?
Aye.
And Mr. Marcucci, aye. And so should we come by town hall to sign those?
Yes, I'm going to leave it with Marion. So if you can come in and sign it with Marion, that would be great.
Okay, great.
And our next action item is a vote to authorize deficit spending for the fiscal year 2021 snow and ice budget.
This is not something we've had to do in the last few years with a more mild winter, but given the storms we've had, we're currently down, this was from February 18th, down to $52,000 in the budget. So in order to deficit spend, you need to authorize us to deficit spend that.
So I would move that we would authorize deficit spending for fiscal year 2021 for the snow and ice budget.
Second.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Murby?
Yes.
And Mr. Marcucci, yes.
Next action item, Kingsbury Club Solar Project, tax agreement and alternative on bill credit agreements.
Nick, do you want to give the update on this?
Sure. So you have in the packet was sent out last week were the 2 tax agreements for the one for the solar canopy and the other for the solar rooftop. In addition to that, the alternative on-bill credit agreements were also included in the packet, taking into account in some reactions and some edits since the conversations were had a couple months ago with the developers of that project. So if any questions or concerns now, we are happy to discuss them. Mark's looked at everything and But if you're ready to approve them, we can move that forward as well.
I don't have any questions.
I have no questions either. They got my middle initial wrong on the signature block, but other than that, I have no questions on it. So.
And I'm recusing myself because of a professional relationship.
Right. So we want to then approve. We want to approve them. I want to make sure I get the titles of these correct. So we want to approve the energy credit purchase agreement. So I would move that we approve and authorize, I guess, Gus and me to sign the energy credit purchase agreement between Two Ice House LLC and the town of Medfield.
I think it's agreements because there's the installation, there's two of them. Just to correct that.
So there's two energy credit purchase agreements.
Yes. And
this is the problem of printing things out on both sides of the
right.
paper.
Your name is equally, your middle initials wrong on both, if it makes you feel better.
So I would move that we approve and authorize Gus and me to sign the two energy credit purchase agreements between Two Ice House LLC and the town of Medfield.
Second.
Mr. Murby.
Aye.
And Mr. Marcucci, aye. And then this other agreement is the pilot agreement?
Correct.
The tax agreement. So I would move that we authorize.
Mr. Chair.
Well, it's Mr. Acting Chair, Mark.
Mr. Acting Chair.
The chair is recused. So, yes, with that
Mr.
correction.
Marcucci. So there is an issue here, which is the need for town meeting authorization. So I don't know how you want to address that, but it should be reflected in the motion.
Yeah, so I would move that we approve, subject to town meeting approval, the two tax agreements under Mass General Laws, Chapter 59, Section 38 HB between Two Ice House LLC and the town of Medfield.
And before I second Mark, quick question. Does that, given that we need town meeting approval, is it fine for us to sign these? Or do we not sign these until there's town meeting approval?
I think it's probably 6-1 and half does the other because you made it a clear precondition.
Okay. Then second.
Mr. Murby?
Aye.
Mr. Marcucci, aye.
And do we come by while we're signing the warrants, we sign those as well, Christine? Okay.
Well, I mean, if it's subject to town meeting vote, I would maybe correct what I said earlier or clarify it. I don't think you would sign them right now. You can vote it, but hold off signing until you have the town meeting authority.
So we're authorized to sign. We can sign after town meeting.
Okay,
Right.
that makes sense.
Taking so long on these, I'll actually bring them to town meeting.
And I didn't see something in here on the 106 Adams Street.
It's there.
It's the same tax agreement. This is just a separate project altogether. And it's just a small rooftop project, about 130 kilowatts, I believe, with the similar assessment on taxes per megawatt.
So it's the same. That's why. Okay. So.
And
Nick, it's the same, financially the same?
Correct.
Is it the same? It's the same size installation?
So the rate of the pilot is, the rate of the tax agreement is the same as the rate in the other two. So it's $7,000 per megawatt. It's a smaller system, about 184.184 megawatts. So it's a total annual payment of $1,288 over the 20-year lifetime of the agreement.
So the method we're using for the Ice House Road is the same calculation method that we're using here, is what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay, and then these are all going to be subject then to town meeting approval with the and maybe we'll see if we can get more leeway to do that in the future. Got it. Okay.
All right. So I would.
And just FYI, the template that Nick and I have been using was developed in Franklin with outside counsel with expertise in this area, and went over extensively, negotiated extensively. We pretty much have given it to folks in Medfield and basically saying, change the project, and et cetera, but all the legalese stays the same.
But Mark, I mean, Nick, there was some significant negotiations, I think, with Ice House Road on how that was structured. So does this reflect that not the same numbers, but the same methodology, or is this a different methodology?
So just to differentiate here, so the Adam Street one is it's a rooftop solar project. The town is not buying any credits from it. So the credit agreements that we were doing for Kingsbury, that was one set of agreements.
Yep.
Where the town is purchasing those credits. For
Right.
Adam Street, all we're doing here is, because it's taxable personal property, is we're entering a 20-year tax agreement for the personal property of the solar panels themselves.
And the calculation of that tax agreement here is consistent with the calculation of the tax agreement for the Ice House Road.
Right.
And I guess maybe those are all consistent maybe with the one that you started with, Mark, is what I guess I'm hearing.
Correct.
Okay.
And hopefully we would have another one for the town garage as we get closer to finalizing that project as well.
Okay.
And it was alluded to, my understanding is there is legislation pending somewhere at the State House that would address the issue of authority to have these arrangements.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm trying to understand is this tax agreement something which is subject to a statutorily defined, and I'm not trying to get more money out of this particular one. I just want to understand what we're looking at. Is this tax agreement sort of specified by statute at what it needs to be? Is it simply that it was successfully negotiated with someone in Franklin and we're just adopting it wholesale? And where I'm coming from is I keep thinking of the pilot agreements that universities have with Boston and how they keep going up and down. So that's my only real baseline reference for how these agreements have worked in other places under other circumstances. I'm just trying to understand.
So the starting point is the acronym PILOT, which is
Right.
payment in lieu of tax.
Correct.
So it depends on the context, the type of taxes that otherwise the entity would be subject to in terms of what type of an agreement you have.
Yeah.
The focus on these agreements was the ability to even out payments over a period of time so that you're giving some a comfort level to the developer as well as projections to the municipality in terms of what to expect.
Mhm.
The statutory scheme in the context of solar facilities is pretty much lacking right now because there was a gap created years ago in the taxing law with respect to solar and wind powered facilities.
Mhm.
The Department of Revenue took the position that really only applied if it was for your own use on your own property, but if they were commercial installations, they were subject to taxation. But there isn't any legislation to back that up, and there's been some disagreement among government agencies on that point. That's where there needs to be clarification. In the meantime, developers have recognized that these things should be taxed. By analogy, other types of facilities are taxed, and they're willing to enter into these agreements in order to be able to proceed with the project.
Mhm. So I get all that. Here's my question. How was the amount of payments distributed over time determined?
Nick came up with a formula. It just needs to pass muster with the Department of Revenue that it's got a rational basis, the same way that methodologies are applied to taxing anything. So you're looking at, whether it's the megawatts that are being generated or the unit prices or whatever. I don't know what the exact basis is. He does, but you just need to have something that will Pass
Okay.
muster.
I'm good there. Nick, when you came up with the payment for this agreement, did you use the same factors that you used with Ice House Road?
Broadly speaking, yes. And in addition to that, we have several proposals in front of us for the town garage, which is a bigger system. In the pilot, the tax payments that were proposed as part of those proposals to the town were around the same ballpark as the 106 Adams, even with that one at a bigger structure. So I felt based on how the Kingsbury project went through and based on proposals that are coming into the town for the town garage itself, that where this proposal came in for 106 Adams kind of fit and went above market a bit based on the research and numbers that I've seen elsewhere. So the town garage will be about twice the size, and the proposals for tax agreements for that project that we've seen are about the same dollar value that we're getting out of the 106 Adams site.
So I'm not trying to second guess your judgment. I'm just trying to understand it.
Yep.
You did a calculation for the tax agreement for Ice House Road. And it sounds like that's some factor applied to the size of the installation.
Correct. And in addition to that, at the end of the day with Ice House Road, it was part of kind of an overall package of total value to the town. So it's kind of a two-step there. When it came to 106 Adams, it's more about where is the market right now for proposals coming into the town on similarly sized arrays and similarly sized systems.
Okay, is the factor that you used for this third project, is the factor that you used higher or lower than what you used on Ice House Road? Recognizing it's a slightly different situation, I just directionally higher or lower?
So Ice House and Adams Street are the same.
Okay.
Adams Street is higher than numbers that we are seeing for the town garage.
Got it. Okay. Okay. That tells me what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Sure.
So I would move that we vote to sign subject to and after town meeting approval, the tax agreement under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 59, Section 38HB between 106 Adams Solar LLC and the town of Medfield.
Second.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Murby?
Yes.
And Mr. Marcucci, yes.
We have nothing on our consent agenda or citizen comment. Town administrator updates, Chris.
I just have a few things tonight. I wanted to give you an update. I know that it's changing every day, but just a vaccine update. So last week, the Department of Public Health notified town administrators and town managers that they would no longer provide vaccines to local boards of health. They wanted to make sure they were utilizing regional sites and large mass vaccination sites such as Gillette. They just opened Natick Mall this week. We're still working with the town of Needham and we're utilizing the vaccines that they had already been assigned. So some of our residents still have appointments at Needham and they'll be honored until that vaccine runs out. I just wanted to talk about, this was the reason why the Board of Health felt strongly that this was not something we wanted to take on. I think we have an incredibly smart group of people on our Board of Health who were able to see that this was what was going to happen. And it was smart for us not to invest in that infrastructure to then have that vaccine taken away from us. So once again, the Board of Health has saved us an incredible amount of money this year. So thank you to them. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the fall, Mass DEP set a new drinking water standard for mass water suppliers in terms of PFAS. It's now 20 parts per trillion. Medfield participated in voluntary testing through a DEP grant. Our results came back below the 20 parts per trillion at each well. And we're currently in our second round of confirmatory testing, and I'll keep you updated when we get those final results back. I had a conversation with Scott McDermott last night, and he's requested an appointment at next Tuesday's meeting to talk about the logistics of town meeting. We want to talk about the dates, times, the number of warrant articles, but I think we have some happy news for him on that. But the discussion will be whether or not we want to postpone town meeting for a few weeks in terms of weather. So just so you're prepared to talk about that next week, we're going to be concentrating on 2 nights outside and weather accommodations for that. I was just told today there's going to be a joint meeting between the Board of Health and the school committee. It's tentatively scheduled for March 9th, and I'll let you know once the time's been finalized on that. And in discussion with the warrant committee, we have decided to move the date of the warrant hearing to March 23rd. So you'll see in your packet on the agenda, unfortunately, you're meeting every Tuesday in March as we get closer to town meeting. So like Todd said, maybe we'll give you June and July off this year. That's all I have for this evening.
Okay,
it's not
thank you.
every Tuesday in March, because March 30th is also Tuesday, right?
Yes, we haven't put that on there yet, but yeah,
It's coming. Get ready.
It may come.
trying to
Selectmen
bring it to you
reports.
slowly.
Gus, do you have anything as a selectman report?
Just a couple of brief things. One, let's see, I guess it was last or 2 Wednesdays ago. Yeah, 2 Wednesdays ago, I followed you in the tour of the Medfield food cupboard, Mike. I think you were just in front of me, and I enjoyed the tour. I'd never actually toured the food cupboard before. It helped me to get a sense of sheer magnitude in terms of space they need and how they work, and I had a very good discussion with the folks there. I found myself trying to get calibrated on whether the facility they needed was sort of a warm, welcoming place for people to come to pick up food, or if it was more like the drive-through beer place that was near my son's college down in Pennsylvania that was a bit more industrial. You just drove in one end and went the other. And the answer I got is, oh, it's kind of a blend of the two. So because there is a certain industrial quality to some of the operation, but it should be something that people welcome. There were no immediate easy answers there, obviously, but I think anybody that knows anything about what the Medfield food cupboard has done appreciates the role that it plays in the town. I came away with a deeper appreciation of the way that they operate, which was helpful for me. And then later that night, I tuned in for the historical commission's hearing on the Clark Tavern. I have to say, first off, I think they were going to doing their best to break the Board of Selectmen's records for the longest meetings that you could possibly have. But bottom line is, I came away extremely impressed with the sincerity and the in-depth consideration that they had around what to do by way of whether or not to impose a demolition delay. I looked at it as difficult and prolonged as the discussion was. I looked at it as a great example of what a democratic institution should be like when it's running right, which is, a sincere, respectful, but rigorous debate. That I just came away very impressed with what they did and how carefully they considered that. I did see an email I think we all got of one resignation from I think it's the Historical Commission, and with regret, I'm sorry that in fact is what's happening. We certainly respect the decision, but my overall impression is that there's people there that are doing an awful lot of good for the town, and I appreciated the effort I saw that night.
Thanks, Gus.
That's it.
Mike?
Yeah, thanks for that, Gus. I think it was obvious in reading the summary from Dave Temple on it. I don't think it was an easy decision for the commission to make, and I think it's unfortunate that for a number of reasons that the tavern is not going to be saved, and that's unfortunate. And I think we probably missed our window to do it a few years ago. And the town kind of chose not to do that. So hopefully we won't repeat the choices that we made back then. And learned a lesson from it. Unfortunately, it's at the price of that building. We have a collective bargaining session on Thursday with the police union to kick off that process, again, with the goal of that negotiation concluding so that we can put whatever it needs to be on the town meeting warrant this year. I think there's a placeholder, Christine, I believe, for that one as well, if we can get that one done. And so we are going to be starting, it's going to be a hybrid meeting as we hopefully start to ease back into in-person meeting. It's going to be starting on Zoom for the public portion of the meeting, and then the executive session is going to take place in person, socially distanced, masked, and all the rest of it, complying with all approved regulations. But hopefully it will be a sign of things to come as our meetings begin to transition back to being in person. If all of the numbers which have been exceptionally positive over the last 6 weeks continue in that direction, and the vaccination rates continue to increase, I think we are seeing hopefully the far end of a lot of this in April and May. And so I think we should at some point find room on our agenda for us to meet with the Board of Health. And as we start to look at reopening, those parts of the town government that are under our jurisdiction, I'm thinking in particular of the Council on Aging, whose clientele should be mostly vaccinated shortly. And I think, frankly, who have probably suffered maybe second most or most after school kids in this whole thing from all the isolation and everything that this has brought on. So I think we should try to make it a priority with the consultation of the Board of Health, to get that to reopen as soon as we can, and get Roberta and the Council on Aging involved as well. I think we've got to start to think in that mode, because it's coming up on a year here. And I think that it's been a real struggle for so many people, and so many, especially older people who live alone as it is. So just something to put on for our agendas coming up in March. And that's all. I don't think I have anything else to report from a
Sounds like we now have an agenda for March 30th.
And Mike, I think that Roberta really wants to open as soon as she possibly can. So that would be good to.
Yeah, I think we need to push in that direction. I think we really do. So.
Yep. So I just about the Clark Tavern, I would just mention that I really regret that we're not keeping the original building, and that the town had an opportunity to have a tavern there, and I regret that never happened. But I guess my landlord in Deb's office that I use these since the virus came, is Dave McCready, and I did have a discussion with Dave McCready about what was going on several weeks ago, and it was interesting to me because he told me that basically in the building where the Avenue and the Botox facilities are, the restaurant and the whatever the Botox facility is, he said there's basically nothing left of that building that was there from before, so that he's basically apparently going to do the same thing with the Clark Tavern that happened to that. What I think it was the Wills building, but it hasn't been Wills for a long time. And so I look at the Avenue building now, and I guess I like it. It reminds me of what used to be there. Although I used to like to go into Wills and hear the floorboards creak. And so I do wish that we have the Clark Tavern and the actual wood from the 1700s. So the only other thing that I have to report on is that there was an Energy Committee meeting. Again, they're just heavily involved in the state hospital project and just a lot of other things. They're just very active now. Long meetings, and that's it for me. Chris or Nick, did you want to comment on any of the informational things?
I would like to comment on one of them.
Okay, Mike.
If you would. I know it's all very well intentioned, and it's really great to get the guidance on how to get a tenant appointed to the Medfield Housing Authority. I think it's a great, well-intentioned, idea. It's really well done. I think one of the things that I've learned kind of in my work on the Affordable Housing Trust and really come to appreciate is all of the obstacles that we put in front of people when we're allegedly trying to help them. There was a quote with respect to the vaccine distributions from some public health, and I forget who it is, but some public health expert saying that so much effort was being put into making sure that no 74-year-old got the vaccine. And I think some of the same mentality applies with a lot of these programs that are designed to help people and well-intentioned and in housing, and there's so much bureaucracy, which obviously creates opportunities for the people who manage those bureaucracies. And you're trying to help people who are in difficult straits already, and you load them up with a lot of paperwork, a lot of hoops to fulfill, a lot of things to do. And a comment that, or sort of a phrase that I keep coming back to that we don't appreciate that much is that complexity is both a tax and a subsidy, and that the more complicated we make things, it's a subsidy to the people who can manage the complexity. It's a tax to the people who have a harder time doing it. And just looking at the flow chart in this thing of what we're going to do to try to find a tenant to serve on the Medfield Housing Authority, which is very well intentioned. I think having voices of tenants and people who've lived in housing authority properties on the board is a really, really great idea. And it's good that we actually have some guidance in this long memo about how to go about doing this, but it did remind me of this general issue that we have. And I think frankly, one of the reasons that a lot of the stimulus and CARES Act and all these kind of things worked reasonably well at for mostly what it's trying to do is that it didn't have a lot of that, right? It was really just, we're just going to dump a lot of money on people. And if it turns out you got it wrongly, we'll go back and try to get it back from you later. But I can only imagine how it would have worked if we tried to vet all of these things through, to stand up. And we've seen what happens because the bureaucratic side of the public health response has been less effective than sort of the welfare stimulus response to it because it was done more easily. And so it's a little bit of a soapbox for me here, because it's a frustration in the housing process when you're trying to do something. Everybody has this right intention in mind, but there is so many things to go through that make it more difficult and frequently make it more difficult for people who are already in a very difficult situation. And I thought it was an illustration of that, and no knock on Ben Stone, the director of the Division of Public Housing, who wrote this memo. I think it's helpful guidance, and he is trying to apply the rules the legislature has put down and all of these kind of unintended things that got in the way of trying to achieve this goal. But it did illustrate that I think we need to do things, figure out a little bit of a better way to do some of these things than we have. So soapbox over, but comment on the informational item over.
So let me just publicly acknowledge that Mike has clearly demonstrated his attention span is far longer than mine was. I didn't get all the way to the end of it.
Well, I think, Gus, if I got frustrated doing this, your head might explode reading through some of it. So
it's coming close.
All right. Anything else then?
No, I think we're good.
All right.
Party's
I will
over.
move that we adjourn.
Second.
Mr. Peterson?
Yep.
Mr. Murby?
Aye.
All right. Mr. Marcucci, aye. See you all next week.
Good to see you all.
Take
Take care.
care.